I was here 10 years ago.
They took a kidney out.
So was I.
When you had the ceremony.
As we get older, everything gets a little bit.
Well, you've changed. I mean, you look good, though. You look great. 85.
Hi, Ted.
I just visited where my husband's buried.
Good.
And cleaned up,
Good.
you know,
Fantastic.
the old flowers, and I take a scissor and cut
20 after 10.
and then they
How would you like to do a little discussion?
yes.
I'd be happy to go.
Okay, all right. All right, then why don't we go like this? And we'll just stand right like this.
All right.
And we are actually live on Facebook on German American Radio at this time, as we're preparing for the memorial service to commemorate the 100th anniversary on this Veterans Day 2018 of the passing of Henry Gunther. Ted Potthast is the treasurer and a longtime ranking member of the German Society here in Baltimore, Maryland. And Ted, by the way, as we have mentioned a number of times, is a driving force behind German American Radio and our Facebook efforts as well. We're glad to have you with us today wherever you are watching on Facebook Live. Ted, tell us in your own words the significance of this day.
Well, for the people of Baltimore and Maryland, we are very anxious to preserve the memory of Sergeant Gunther because he was one of us. He was a person who grew up in our town, and we consider him to be one of our hometown heroes. So it's our job to preserve his memory, and he is part of our heritage, and the German Society of Maryland in particular has as its role, as one of its missions, to preserve the German American heritage of the state of Maryland. So that would be our motivation for having this event today. And we have brought together quite a few people. We even have someone who has come all the way from Portugal. Jim McFader, who is here with us today, has written a play on Henry Gunther, which is in the process of being made into a movie, and hopefully we will see it within the next year or two, because it takes a long time to produce that type of a movie. So we're doing all we can to preserve the memory of Henry Gunther, and I think we're doing a fairly good job. We have a very good turnout here today. We are in the cemetery, and Henry is buried right behind us here. And there's an angel above his grave, and I don't know if you can see it.
Do you want to check my test cam to make sure that it's very well?
Anyway, that would be our contribution to the preservation of the memory of Henry Gunther.
Yesterday I was up in Hanover, Pennsylvania. I walked into a coffee shop and talked to a gentleman. And he brought up the subject of World War I, and he said, 100 years ago, it's incredible to think that it was that long. And then I shared with him briefly the Henry Gunther story and went into the detail to a point, and he said to me, that seems almost mythical. I said, no, sir, it's not mythical. It's quite an amazing story. And I suggested that he go online to research Henry Gunther, who he was, the events leading up to his death, 1 minute before the Armistice on November 11, 1918. That's quite a story, and they'll allude to some respect, I would imagine, to that today.
Well, thank you very much. I think you said quite a bit about Henry, and his comrades called him Harry. So we've been calling him Henry, but I just learned from talking to Jim McFader that his comrades always referred to him as Harry. So maybe we should start calling him Harry.
That works for me.
Good.
Ted, give us kind of an overview as to how the plans for this event that we're hosting here moments from now came to be? Who thought to do this, and how many people have helped in this effort?
Well, the person behind it is Walt Mathers. Walt came to me in 2009 and told me that there had been a monument placed over in France for Sergeant Gunther, but there was no marker at Sergeant Gunther's grave here in the cemetery. So Walter and I went to the cemetery, talked to the management, and persuaded them to go along with us and put up a monument. And that's what got the whole thing started.
Mr. Ted, can I put a poppy on your jacket?
Sure.
Yeah, this nice lady is putting a poppy on your jacket, Ted. We're doing the
Swanette.
Thank
ceremony.
you on that.
You're welcome.
Does it work?
Yep, I've got it on your zipper.
Well, thank you.
There you go. So
She put it with symmetry, she put it with grace, and she put it with class.
Oh.
Now you pulled it off.
I'm so
He
sorry.
was inspecting your work. That's what he was doing.
Okay, well stand still.
Okay,
Can you see it?
wonderful.
Okay.
While Ted gets his boutonniere, for lack of a better word, arranged here, if you just joined us on Facebook Live, we are streaming live the impending 100th anniversary memorial commemoration
Thank you, dear.
of the passing of Henry Gunther, who on November 11, 1918, was the last of more than 2 million casualties who did not make it home after the Great War. We know it better, of course, as World War I. We were saying a moment ago that a number of people have put this together. You mentioned Walt Mathers, you mentioned some other folks. Would you like to pick up on that story some more and share how this came together?
Well, in 2010, we had a big event right here where we're standing today to dedicate the monument of Henry Gunther. And we had a very large crowd. We had a number of Henry Gunther's great nieces and nephews who were present. So they're getting ready to start the event. So I guess we should adjourn our discussion for a moment.
That sounds fine. We're about 5 minutes away, and we'll thank you very much, Ted, for your comments.
Very good. Thank
And we're about set to go, and we'll simply leave things running, and you can kind of catch the ambiance and the preparation, and we'll zero in on the podium as our speakers will commence our time today. My name is Bob Mathers, and thank you so very much for being a part of our coverage today of the 100th anniversary memorial celebration and commemoration of Henry Gunther.
These are the only ones that have
It's right here by the guy. Right there. See it? Sit in. I got it. Thanks.
Excuse me, good morning. Father, not? No, Father, there's a big confusion. There's no Father not. Maybe misunderstanding on the phone. So I'm Father Bruce, and I'm supposed to be pastor of Sacred Heart of Jesus. Yeah, so I'm Father Bruce. Anyway, maybe there's confusion with Father Nat.
I was talking to you, so
Father Nat,
if there's confusion, it's me.
Father Nat, but he couldn't.
I'll even say, like, not like the builders in Baltimore.
we were supposed to bring our own wreath for the grave, but I did bring my own. Very good. He's the master of ceremonies, Mr. Rich. So he'll let us write this. Stand in the sun, maybe.
All right.
There's a flag behind it.
I'm going to bring this closer, so because we're live with this right now on Facebook.
So anyway, that's we try to we've never tolerated any sort of thing we have some weirdos showing the door. Vince, I wanted to ask you. So did I. So 68. I just have my Gale.
I was just there for our third. Behind Ted. Behind Ted.
You see him? Not there now.
Was Brother Don up there? Yeah, he was there when I was there. He was like on his radio carbon date. He didn't have a birthday. He was radio carbon.
He's over here.
But I mean, he was like 100 years old when I was there.
Well, some of the less sensitive of us would refer to the older brothers as Brother Holiday, meaning that if they pass away in the school closed for a day, we get a holiday.
No, it's great school. I think going up in the tower. What's your name up in the tower?
Yeah, I can't remember where I put it, but it's
Did you find him? Did you find him?
No.
we have over in the memorial gym. There's a plaque to our St. Joseph alumnus who died in World War II. There's a shop on there, but it's not my immediate family. I'm not sure there are any
Maybe you sat
connections.
down somewhere.
They were from Baltimore. And it was a shop.
I'm looking for Bob Bruce. I knew he was here.
But I made a big deal with the school.
That's right. If I don't see him now.
Prominently displayed, aren't you? They did, yeah.
I don't know how you think things on
I speak German. Well, I thought it was interesting to announce here about Gunther is the priest who came to the house was his father United.
Oh, yeah.
So
I wish my English because the Not Very Farm makes a lot of money. I'm Siegfried Alter. Nice to know you, Father Bruce.
But you know, Henry wasn't a member of the Germans.
That's a very Irish name. Yes. You know, I done that. Maybe I should give you my. Are you in the German Society? Yes. Yeah, past presidents.
Oh, really? Yeah. They were accepting women. Men had to wait Catholic.
Are you? I'm the pastor at Sacred Heart of Jesus in Town.
Good morning.
Sergeant Gunther was
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Bob and Reverend Otto for asking for warmer weather. I thought it was going to be so cold today, but it warmed up good. Look, I would like to say good morning and thank you for joining us today as we commemorate the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day. And we're also here today to keep alive the memory of Sergeant Henry Gunther, the last soldier killed in World War I. My name is Robert Wish, and I'm a proud member of the German Society of Maryland. At this time, I would, excuse me. Past President Jim Schaub of the German Society would like to welcome everyone.
On behalf of the German Society of Maryland, I welcome all of you to this memorial event. I represent the German Society of Maryland, who, with the Redemptorist Cemeteries of Baltimore, is a sponsor of this event. The German Society was originally organized in 1783 to aid immigrants, and in an era when government social services were barely existed. Our purpose now focuses on preserving German heritage traditions through educational, social, and benevolent programs. It's fitting that we remember Henry Gunther because his life story is part of the history of the German-American community in America. I thank you for coming today. Your presence and what we say and do today will preserve the memory of Henry Gunther. In doing so, we are participating in our National Veterans Day mission to remember and honor all veterans. In the era leading up to World War I, the German-American community was a highly visible, dynamic presence in the United States and in Baltimore in particular. World War I tested whether German immigrants and others of German descent could preserve their traditions while embracing their American identity. We're here today because Henry Gunther represents German Americans of 100 years ago. His service confirmed his full allegiance to America, and by extension, the loyalty to America of the community he came from. Again, welcome. Thank you for coming.
It's with pleasure that I introduce Father Bruce Lenonowski from the Sacred Heart of Jesus Catholic Church, which was Henry Gunther's church. Father, would you give us the invocation, please?
Please stand. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Lord God, when our earthly dwelling lies in death, we gain an everlasting dwelling place in heaven. For your faithful people in death, life is changed, not ended. And so as we gather in this holy place, a place of remembrance, we ask you to revive our faith and stir up our hope, so that as we face the death of so many people in our world today and remember the death of those who gave their lives in the great sacrifice for God and country, we may not lose hope, but remember forever that you are our refuge, that you are our life and our hope. For all our veterans deceased, eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. May they rest in peace. May their souls and the souls of all the faithful departed through the mercy of God rest in peace. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Please be seated. Please stand. And join us in the Dane. quiet choir as we sing the Star Spangled Banner.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the guns bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Thank you very much. Please be seated. At this time, I would like to again thank everybody for coming. At this time, I would like to get Vice President Jim Schaub up here one more time. Jim, I invited Governor Larry Hogan to be with us today, but unfortunately he's having his own memorial service at the State House, and that's also tied in with the Naval Academy. But as a member of his Centennial Commission for World War I, he asked me to give you this proclamation. I would like to read it to you. The State of Maryland, Governor of the State of Maryland, to the German Society of Maryland, 100th anniversary of Armistice Day tribute. Greetings, be it known that on behalf of the citizens of this state, in recognition of a patriotic tribute to the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day, with grateful appreciation for the German Society of Maryland's ongoing efforts to keep alive the spirit of Sergeant Henry Gunther, the last soldier to be killed in World War I, and as our citizens join us in expressing our admiration, great respect, and best wishes for a memorial service, we are pleased to confer upon you this Governor's citation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. You can take the roof here. I had all my notes in order, but as it goes, things got mixed up. There are a few people I'd like to introduce today, and one of them is Jim McFavor. Jim, are you here? Could you be recognized? Jim? Well, evidently he's still here, but he's a former NBC war correspondent, and he wrote a play about Henry Gunther, and he hopes that it will become a movie. Him and his wife traveled all the way from Portugal to be with us today. He is an expert on the life and death of Henry Gunther, and I do like to meet him when
He's right over there.
Thank you. Are there any members of Henry Gunther's family with us today? Will you please come up here so everyone can see the relatives of Henry Gunther?
Sure.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carol Gunther Aikman, and my dad was Henry John Gunther. Henry John was the nephew of Henry N. Gunther, and my dad was actually named after Henry N. when he was born in 1923. Dad grew up in the family home on 3011 Eastern Avenue, where Henry N. also grew up. That was the family home, and so thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's such an honor to remember him in this way. He was a brave hero, and he did a lot to make us proud in our country here and in our German American community as well.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
At this time, I would once again like to introduce the Dane-Meyer Choir to sing a song written about Henry Gunther that was written by Dane-Meyer.
Here is a tale of Baltimore son, fighting his demons as he fought in World War I. Henry Gunther. Army censors had found Henry's letter recently, where he complained that the trenches were misery. He was demoted and feared that they'd doubt his loyalty, since his parents immigrated from Germany. And the clock ticks down on the war to end all wars, where 10 million soldiers marched one way. Bringing up the rear, one bank clerk from Baltimore, proving loyal to the USA. To the 10 million add one more. Henry Gunther from Baltimore. When his unit met enemy guns while out in France, while his comrades took cover, Henry took his chance. Though he knew that the war had just a minute left to go, he ignored every warning and ran toward the foe. And the clock ticks down on the war to end all wars, where 10 million soldiers took their last breath. Bringing up the rear, one bank clerk from Baltimore, running all alone into his death. Tally up the last death in the war. Henry Gunther from Baltimore, Baltimore. Though they yelled for him to stop, Henry would not, so the Germans had no choice. Henry was killed with a shot. Seconds later, at the 11th hour's chime, the Germans brought his body back in peacetime. And the clock ticks down on the war to end all wars, where 10 million soldiers shed their blood. Bringing up the rear, one bank clerk from Baltimore, dying bravely there in France's blood, proving loyal and courageous to the core. Henry Gunther from Baltimore.
Speaking for everyone, I thank you so much. Beautiful song and beautiful rendition. Now this time I would like to ask Reverend Siegfried Otto to approach the podium.
Would you please rise, if you're able, for a moment of silence honoring Henry Gunther and all the victims of the wars. We will keep 11 seconds of silence.
Appreciate it. I would like to tell everyone that at 11:30, throughout the nation, churches will be tolling their bells. We hope to have many churches around here tolling the bells too, as the 100th anniversary of the peace bells when World War I ended. As I say, this is a national program. I know that the governor sent letters out to many, many churches. I know I sent letters out to churches in a mile radius. So if we stop the program at any time, is when we start hearing the bells ring. Then we'll continue after that. I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker. Vincent Bass has honored us to be with us today. He's a 26-year veteran of the United States Park Service, and almost 23 of those years were spent at Fort McHenry National Monument and Historic Shrine and the Hampton National Historic Sites in Baltimore. Currently, Vince serves as Chief of Visitor Services at the National Capital's Park East in the District of Columbia. As the Chief of Visitor Services, he and his staff provide for the best visitor experience possible, which includes ranger-led tours, bike tours, youth programs, exhibits, social media, and web presence. Vince is a lifelong Marylander. He grew up during the bicentennial of the Revolutionary War, and his early heroes were General William Smallwood and members of the Maryland 400, who gave the Maryland the nickname of the Old Lion State. Vince believes that an appreciation of one's history makes for a better citizen. Vince also told me that one of the highlights of his life was being made an honorary life member of the 29th Division Association. I've known Vince a few years, and when I asked him to be a speaker for us today, without hesitation, he accepted. And at this time, although you may think this might be Harry Truman in back of me, I'd like to introduce Ranger Vincent Bass.
Before I speak, I would like to introduce a dear friend of mine in total keeping with the ceremony of the day today, Brigadier General Hall Worthington, so that we may stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Sir?
Please face the flags and join me in the pledge. I I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I think it's when you do these things, sometimes these anniversaries and these gatherings, sometimes irony seeks us out. And I couldn't help but, and I'm sure this was entirely unplanned, but where we stand here, and ma'am, if I could ask you to step just for a second here, that the name of the grave right here is Krieg, which is the German word for war. And how interesting it is, and then Gunther's grave is just a few yards behind it. And this is indeed the centennial of the ending of the First World War. And there was a running joke that broke out not long after Armistice Day among the Americans who were over there. And don't forget, World War I lasted really until 1919, which is when the actual peace treaty was written out. So there was a lot of guys that stayed over there under the Army of Occupation. And the running joke was that World War I would certainly last 100 years. 5 years to do the fighting, and 95 years to wrap up all the barbed wire that was strung out all over the place. And I think it's quintessentially American to be invited as a keynote speaker at an event marking the end of World War I, myself being of Lithuanian extraction, invited for the end of World War I by the German Society of Maryland. And I think it just shows what a great melting pot our nation is. And as we stand here in Holy Redeemer Cemetery to mark this centennial of the First World War, the end of the Great War, of course, across the nation, there are events being covered by nationwide broadcasts. And even though there's huge ceremonies going on with leaders of state in France as we speak, somehow I think this ceremony here in this cemetery is the most appropriate place to be. And we gather here to honor our hometown hero, Henry Gunther, German-American, the last American killed in World War I. And we as a people, we're intrigued by firsts, we're intrigued by lasts, we're intrigued by round numbers. I mean, if Gunther was killed 10 days prior, I doubt if we would be here at his grave. We're here because he was the last. And like I said, the 100th, that round number, and intrigued by firsts. And this idea of being intrigued by firsts, this is nothing new. This even happened during World War I. And this is something, an example that the German society can certainly relate to. The first Baltimore officer killed in action in World War I was an editor for the Baltimore News. And he was in the Army Reserves while he was an editor for the Baltimore News. He desperately wanted to fight in World War I. He was called up in April 1917, one of the first to be called up, shipped out in September, actually, 1917. And then on May 29th, 1918, this officer, while on patrol, was shot in the shoulder, patched up, went back, shot in the jaw, patched himself up, and returned, and shortly thereafter was killed from an enemy artillery shell. So this is the first officer from Baltimore City killed. His name, George Buchanan Redwood. And the city council promptly renamed German Street Redwood Street in honor of this officer. So again, firsts, lasts. A centennial, an anniversary, gives us the opportunity to hit the stop button on daily life and reflect. You know, as we should be thinking about all this stuff from time to time, but at least if you have an anniversary, we can come together like this and think about it.
The bells, sir.
The bells, thank you. Thank you, Walt.
Sure.
The pause, to put that stop button and reflect. Centennials are really special. You know, lately, a bunch of us, some of my friends in the audience, in the hall and all, we commemorated the bicentennial of the War of 1812, and some of us were very active in Civil War living history with the 150th, but a 100th is especially unique. And I'll tell you why. Because when you do a centennial, it's the first anniversary in which all the original participants are gone. I think the last World War I veteran died like 5-6 years ago. However, most of the people who take part in the commemoration had a first-hand connection with those who served. So just like in this audience, all the World War I veterans are gone, but probably a lot of you in this audience knew a World War I vet. Some of the older members may have grown up with the World War I vet. And so we have that one foot with that connection of those people who were here, and yet they themselves are gone. We're like that first generation that tells their story when they're not here to tell it themselves. I can remember myself meeting a World War I veteran. His name was William Bandier, and I met him 10 years ago in 1998 when he, for his 100th birthday at the Fort Howard VA Medical Center. And probably some of you remember a World War I veteran yourself. And to be sure, World War I had a lot of colorful people and colorful moments, and I'd like to do a little bit of reflection to kind of brush 100 years worth of dust off of that history. Some terms that came up back then are still with us today, like, well, another day in the trenches, or he's got cooties for lice, or being shell-shocked, or all quiet on the Western Front, and no man's land. Perhaps the most singular, famous American figure of the Great War was Sergeant Alvin York from Tennessee, made famous, of course, even more famous by the movie with Gary Cooper in it. York, credited with killing over 25 enemy soldiers and taking 132 prisoners while taking out a German machine gun post. Or maybe we remember the general in charge, American General John Joseph Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, nicknamed that because he commanded African-American troops in the Indian Wars. Some say he also got the name Blackjack because he was such a stern disciplinarian. And Pershing campaigned to have U.S. forces fight as one army instead of piecemeal. And speaking of African-Americans, we can remember the 369th Regiment from New York City, who distinguished themselves fighting as Americans but within French regiments. And they called themselves the Black Rattlers. But the Germans gave them a bigger nickname, and it stuck, the Hellfighters from Harlem. Even the Germans themselves had a cool hero with the Red Baron. And Romance of the Biplane was not lost on the Americans because we had our ace, Eddie Rickenbacker, with his Hat in the Ring Squadron. Perhaps made more famous by Snoopy and Charles Schultz. But nevertheless, it shows how that transcends generations. Americans back home were intrigued with stories of the Lost Battalion that was cut off for a number of days. And even though a lot of those guys were actually from Wisconsin, most of them were German Americans in the Lost Battalion. The famous story of how they were cut off, and the only communication they had when they were being shelled by their own troops, because they advanced so far forward that the Americans thought that they were Germans, was their last carrier pigeon, Cher Ami, had the last note tied to the leg, and they let it loose, and the Germans were shooting at that and blew one of the legs off the poor bird, but the bird still made it back to the headquarters so that the Americans could stop the shelling on their own men. And you can see that. You can still go to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History to this day, and the bird is still on display. Another regiment, the Fighting 69th, And as we're here in the cemetery, and as Gunther was Catholic, the most decorated priest, chaplain actually, in Army history was a Catholic priest, Father Duffy. And Duffy's friend in the Fighting 69th was an adjutant by the name of Joyce Kilmer, who was killed in 1918 by a sniper. Kilmer wrote a poem, the famous poem, "I Think I Shall Never See Something as Lovely as a Tree." You wonder how many more poems he would have written if he wasn't killed in the summer of 1918. World War I marks the renewed fame. They're always famous, but truly came into their own, the Devil Dogs of the Marine Corps, earning their nickname at the Battle of Belleau Wood. The year 1918 was a critical year for the war. Unlike World War II, where the German army got weaker as the war went along, the German army actually was stronger in 1918 on the Western Front than it had been a few years prior. 1917, Russia capitulated amid communist revolution, and also later that year, the French army itself mutinied against a lot of their own command due to the terrible waste of lives and poor generalship. So the Allies were having a real rough time in 1917, early 1918. And in early 1918, the German army launched out that all-out offensive in March that continued through the summer and was halted in part by U.S. Marines and U.S. soldiers at that Battle of Belleau Wood. And this was really the first war that America would play a role as a major world power, sending 10,000 men a day into an effort. And we would ultimately have about 2 million men in France. A lot of times you talk to some of these Europeans, and I see their point. They say, well, you know, we were fighting this war since 1914. You guys got into it late, 1918. Yeah, but at the tune of 10,000 men a day and 2 million men over there, I think the Allies would have had a tough time winning that war without the United States. One of those 2 million men was Henry Gunther, who belonged to the 79th Division, 313th Regiment, Baltimore's own. The 79th was made up, and the 313th, I should say, is made up mainly of those drafted. Another sister division, the 29th, made up of volunteers of the National Guard. Gunther, being the 313th, was one of the drafted ones. Grew up in Highlandtown, Hoing, in one of the many German sections of Baltimore. And growing up, the world he lived in, you would hear German being spoken at home, German in the streets. Roughly 50% of the city was of German extraction, and 25% of them were right off the boat. And in Highlandtown, 3011 Eastern Avenue, living home with mom and dad. His sweetheart, Olga Grubel, now on a day not dissimilar to the day before the war, you could walk down, maybe he bought a loaf of bread at a bakery called Faustix, or attended Sunday services at a place like Holy Cross Church, if you wanted to walk down into South Baltimore near Federal Hill, because you could hear Catholic Mass down there in German, aside from the Latin parts. Or Zion Lutheran Church, right there in another section of Baltimore. Or the place names that are still there today, Hanover Street, the Hanover Street Bridge. Or Ostend, or Ostend Street, as they would have said at the time. Minutes of the city council itself were kept in German as well as in English. And all the different microbreweries, they didn't call them microbreweries, they were breweries then, or marksmanship clubs. You know, that was all part of that German culture in Baltimore. And in this was Gunther's Baltimore. And in this Baltimore, Gunther was a bookkeeper and bank teller. 1914, war breaks out in Europe. And the famous quote by Sir Edward Grey, the day the war began, where this British guy, Edward Grey, says, "The lamps are going out all over Europe, and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." We could say that the lamps certainly dimmed on the German national culture in Baltimore in 1917, and probably just as fast. It was fast. Just the year prior, when a German submarine visited the city, there were parades and celebrations when the German U-boat Deutschland visited the city. And then a year later, we went from eating sauerkraut to Liberty cabbage. from hamburgers to beef patties. Even the famous German-American author Henry Louis Mencken was shadowed by FBI agents because of his German name. And so you see, maybe it was about having something to prove. America certainly had something to prove. We had to prove we would make the world safe for democracy. General Pershing wanted to prove that American soldiers would fight as good as their European counterparts as an American army. Women had something to prove. They joined the ranks of the nurses. This is a time where women were struggling for the right to vote. And maybe, if enough served, we could show that not only are we citizens, but we should be fully enfranchised female citizens, and we will contribute to the war effort. And I don't think there's any coincidence that universal suffrage for both genders took place a year after World War I ended. Maybe many enlisted men joined to prove that they weren't cowards. And German Americans certainly wanted to prove that they were Americans first. Now, I suppose in a modern, cynical age, maybe all this idea of having something to prove might seem very outmoded, very outdated. However, having a sense of what was right, I don't think that ever goes out of date. American troops arrived in France in large numbers in 1918. 313th trained at Camp Meade, today's Fort Meade. There's a great account by Gunther's friend, Ernest Powell. And he says, on October 18, 1917, several of us were picked up for special training. We became non-commissioned officers. Gunther was a supply sergeant, and I was made a platoon sergeant. Gunther was a good soldier, but he wasn't a happy one. Things worked against him. First, he was of German descent, and we're on our way to fight the Germans. And he was a supply sergeant, and supply sergeants are usually unpopular. Army clothing, as they said at the time, came in two sizes. Too small and too large. Then the supply sergeant, through no fault of his own, took the brunt of every soldier's complaint. So they ship out of Hoboken, New Jersey in July 1918. They arrive in France July 15th. And if you go to this day at the War Memorial in downtown Baltimore, look at the sculpture. You'll see a horse galloping over the waves. That symbolizes these guys like Gunther that were on these ships that sailed across the sea. The mighty war horse going across the sea. And then they went to these box cars that were nicknamed 40 and 8 because you could stuff 40 men or 8 horses in them to get up to the front. And if you go to the Baltimore, Ohio Train Museum down on Pratt Street in West Baltimore, you can see an original 40 and 8 railroad car down there. These tangible symbols of the Great War are still here in Baltimore. Gunther's regiment took advanced training in Champlain, France before going to the front, and conditions were rainy, muddy, and they received guidance from French officers. A little bit of levity that they had a pet mascot, a little dog called Murphy, small pup. Sometimes they called the dog Michael or Mike, even though it was a female dog. When they were gassed later, when German poison gas shells hit, they wrapped the dog up in a blanket, saved the dog's life, and the dog later gave birth to pups that they named Verdun, Verdun and Saint Michel after the Michel offensive. Gunther wrote a letter, this is the infamous letter, wrote a letter to a friend complaining about conditions in the army life. And perhaps what really got him into trouble was adding to the friend that he recommended his friend avoid coming to France. Maybe that was where maybe he crossed the line. He described conditions as unbearable. Military censor picked it up and reduced his rank to private. Now here's the thing. Throughout history, I don't know of anyone who's ever been in the military that didn't complain about the food, the weather, or their commanding officer. So did Gunther really do anything that everyone else wasn't doing? Maybe it was putting it into writing that made it a little bit different. As Father Duffy wrote, every soldier in a combat division thinks his own division is doing all the work and getting none of the credit. Perhaps Gunther's mistake was putting it in writing. He was then assigned to Powell's platoon, so at least he was assigned to someone he knew. At first, these different regiments were used piecemeal with the French, and then they were put into one American army for the Grand Meuse-Argonne offensive.
And this was the hardest terrain. The Germans have been occupying this terrain really since 1914. So they had 4 years to get the barbed wire, the bunkers, and everything. And the French and the British realized, well, those Americans, they're fresh. They're bringing fresh troops. Let's put them into the worst part of the line. In addition to that, it was hilly terrain. So literally the worst part, wooded terrain, ideal for defense. Gunther volunteered to become a runner. The Germans were sending teams through the American lines to cut the telephone lines. And so to quote Powell, we set up a runner system. Carrying messages was hazardous because of enemy snipers. And of course the Germans knew if you shot the runners, you killed the communications. It was all volunteer. And on the first day in the trenches at the front, regimental runner came to my post and they asked for volunteers. And before I could even ask for a volunteer, Gunther said, I'll do it. And he served for a whole week as a messenger, running in this dangerous duty. So he started volunteering, again, proving himself. He wanted to prove he was loyal. I'm sure he wanted to have his rank restored. Again, he wasn't much different than many young men who's maybe he saw himself as indestructible too. And you remember when you were 17, 18, 19, early 20s, you're indestructible. I got a quote from a guy who was an ambulance driver in World War I. He said, when you go to war as a boy, you have a great illusion that you're immortal. Other people get killed, but not you. Then when you're badly wounded for the first time, you lose that illusion, and then you know it can happen to you. This ambulance driver who said that was a guy called Ernest Hemingway. Powell wrote that Gunther brooded over the demotion and kept to himself. But he still was a runner, and he was wounded. So if you take Hemingway's quote at face value, when you first get wounded, you realize that you're not immortal. Well, Gunther did get wounded, and he still did it anyway. This battle, the Meuse-Argonne, continued October into November. And then we can focus on this day. Let's focus on this critical day, because why did he do it? That's why one of the reasons we're here. The possibility of the armistice came on November 7th. Revolution was breaking out in Germany with food shortages. The unlimited manpower the U.S. was sending, the Germans knew that they couldn't win. An overture was made by the Germans to General Foch, the French general in charge of the American armies, and the French armies, and the British armies. The overall commander on the Western Front was a Frenchman. He gave his demands that the Germans had 72 hours to respond. And he was also adamant that the war would continue full tilt until he heard back and the Germans responded in writing to those demands. The final deadline was 11 a.m. on November the 11th. Pershing was disappointed when he heard that the war would be ending soon, because the Grand Offensive was just really starting to hit its stride. And he wanted Germany to just give an unconditional surrender. So he was adamant that there would be no let up in the American attack up until that point. On this morning, 100 years ago, 5 o'clock in the morning on November 11th, the Germans showed up with all the paperwork in hand for the armistice. Shortly thereafter, Pershing sent notice that the hostilities would end at 11. However, Pershing gave no guidance whatsoever as to what to do at that time. This is where different generals under Pershing's command fell into one of two categories. Those who decided to play it safe, knowing that the war was going to end in a few hours, and kept their men in defensive positions. Or some, looking for advancement, fame, or whatever, saw a fast fading opportunity for glory. For example, the general who was in charge of the 5th Marine Division ordered the Marines to capture a bridgehead over the Meuse River that morning, and they did. They had captured a town beyond the bridgehead. Another regiment, the 92nd Regiment, African Americans, was ordered to attack a town at exactly 10:30 a.m. that morning. The official orders from 313th Gunther's Regiment said, quote, this came out this morning, knowing full well the armistice was coming, quote, you will proceed and you will attack Ville devant Chaumont. Hostilities will cease on the whole front at 11th hour. Today at French time. Until that hour, operations are ordered to be pressed vigorously. At the 11th hour, lines will halt in place, and no man will move one step backward or forward. He will stay exactly where he is. At 11 o'clock, men will cease firing and dig in. In case the enemy does not likewise suspend the firing, firing will be resumed, but no further advance will be permitted. No fraternization will be allowed. Brigade and other commanders concerned are charged with the important duties of transmitting these orders to their troops and securing the strict enforcements. Rockets or other signals may be used to notify the front line of the arrival of 11 hour, just as soon as possible. Determine the exact track to front by coordinates and indicate the exact position of your flanks through liaison groups and notify the headquarters at once, General Nicholson. So the order was given to attack, and on the morning was a very foggy morning, November the 11th. Gunther's unit was moving through a dense fog near the town, indicated in the order, Ville devant Chaumont. At 10:45, the squad that Gunther was attached to was stopped by a German roebuck. Gunther's friend, Sergeant Powell, they were side by side, Powell Road, it kept up, the German machine gun opened up and kept us down. We couldn't see them and they couldn't see us, so it's the fog. Okay, we keep thinking, we forget about that fog. We hugged the ground. We sent a lot of rifle fire in the direction of their position. He said they could not see the position. They just received the fire, so they're firing into the fog. Now, these guys were supposed to have an American machine gun battalion to back them up, but they got lost in the fog, and they couldn't see the Germans anyway. So there was this eerie silence in the fog, and the minutes were ticking down. They said, now the Americans, when Gunther and Sergeant Powell hit the ground, they were approximately 300 yards from the German machine gun. And I went online, and you can see that German machine gun position guarding the road was on a hillside. So if we're like where Gunther was here, that machine gun probably where that big building is back there, probably about that distance. He said, all of a sudden, you could hear the gunfire. The German machine guns had been quiet, and it was an eerie silence. And then the German gunners, they were looking through the fog. Powell said Gunther, who'd been laying side by my side, suddenly jumped up, ran to the fog, ran toward the Germans. And maybe he thought the fog would give him the cover he would need to capture that machine gun nest. Maybe he wanted the men in his platoon to see him as brave because he said, I'm going over there. And the guys in the platoon were like, no, stay here. And he had been a runner, but you don't see the runners in action. So maybe he wanted the other guys to see him going in. Another account said that Gunther actually said, quote, I'm going to take that machine gun nest. And though his companions told him not to, he started off with his Browning automatic rifle. The Germans, the machine gun they had was the machine gun 08. MG08 was the main machine gun used, had a rate of fire, 500 rounds per minute. The whole thing weighed about 136 pounds, kind of barrel. The Germans probably looking through the fog, they could see an outline of a figure emerging, coming closer. They probably would have seen the outline like the helmet, and they knew it would have been an American soldier. Then all of a sudden, Gunther fired a few times at the Germans. The Germans waved him back. He kept coming firing. And then the machine gun belt fed to the right into the unit. It would have taken two, and they said it was two Germans. One would have been the loader, the other one with his hands slowly squeezing the trigger, the minutes ticking down. Every second, Gunther was yet a few feet closer to that German. You could almost hear his foot falling as he ran toward the position. You could almost see the whole thing unfold in slow motion as the Germans slowly squeezed the trigger of the machine gun. You could almost hear his men seeing them looking up through the fog, seeing him disappear into the fog, and then you could hear, and that was about as far as it went. Gunther was struck in various places, most notably through his head, and hit the ground at 11:58 a.m. Literally about a minute, 2 minutes. Technically, the official report was 2 minutes before the war ended. But it's not like everybody was looking at their watch at that time either. It might have been at 11 on the button. The Germans then put him on a stretcher and carried him back to American lines. So he got close. Because if he wasn't close, the Americans would have just got him. So the fact that the Germans had to carry him all the way back shows you he was probably almost right on their position when they got him. And the whole thing reminds me of the poem by Alan Seeger, one of the first Americans killed in World War I, where Seeger wrote, "I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. When spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air, I have a rendezvous with death when spring comes black, blue days and fair. And maybe he shall take my hand and lead me into his dark land and close my eyes and quench my breath. And maybe I shall pass him still, but I have a rendezvous with death on some scarred slope of a battered hill. And I to my pledged word am true, I shall not fail that rendezvous." Over 10,000 men would be killed or wounded or missing on that very morning. This morning, the last hours of the war, 10,000 men would be killed, wounded, or missing. Far more than the average of 4,000 a day, which was the cost of World War I. The French had their own Gunther, too, named Augustin Trébuchon, who was killed around 10:40 a.m. They had a trouble dealing with the grief, too, so much that they actually changed the date on the poor man's grave and listed it as November 10th, so that the family, when they visited, wouldn't know that he was killed the day that the war ended. 25-year-old Canadian George Lawrence Price was killed around 10:57, and British Private George Edwin Ellison was killed at 9:30, taking a town that the British wanted to take because it was the first town that they lost. And they did take it that morning. Of course, if they'd have waited 5 hours, they could have marched in it anyway. Lasts and firsts. Things that make us think. Things that we can kind of grab onto. In a sense, what about all the thousands of people, millions that died from the flu epidemic that caught it the minute that the war ended? Perhaps, when people been wondering what did they die for ever since the war ended. And even people like Alvin York questioned it, because when World War II happened, they're like, well, maybe what we did wasn't worthy or didn't do it right, because there had to be a second World War. Or when you call it the war to end all wars, and then all the wars come happening, maybe we didn't do. No, that's not it at all. They did their part. They did their part. It wasn't the failure of the war, it was the failure to enforce the peace that resulted in the Second World War. Maybe it's the moral of the story is constant vigilance. Maybe the moral of the story is, one thing that I'm struck about Gunther is that he was just the average guy. That he was drafted, but he was called up, and he did his duty as it was seen. And yeah, while he did write a letter, it was no more than any other soldier did, as soldiers time immortal. And that in future, whether it's, in 10 years or at this moment, I'm sure there's people around the world serving and doing these kinds of things that, maybe they don't want to be there, maybe they don't like being there, but they're there. And it's only for history later to evaluate what the efficacy was of one particular war or not. But like I said, there's something simple in doing your duty. And maybe, like I say, in a cynical age, maybe for some people that's not the same, but I think for those gathered here, we know what was meant. And that Gunther was indeed a true hero. Our true hero, Baltimore's hero. A sense who gave us a great sense of local pride as an American. And with that, I would like to conclude with one last poem. And Buddy Paul, if you would come up to read, or no, I'll read it for you. A poem that I'm sure you never heard by, Paul, if you could stand up. We served together 25 years. He was 50 years at Fort McHenry. And his uncle, and what was your uncle's first name? Howard Plavin? Yeah, German-American, okay? He was wounded in France, too. And he said it about Memorial Day, but maybe we can take these words to heart. So a poem that you never otherwise would hear. And when he was wounded, he wrote this poem back in a hospital. Memorial Day, you could say Veterans Day, is a day to reflect back o'er the years gone by, to recall the deeds of battlefields of those who had to die. They fought for freedom's cause and peace, a peace for all mankind. Now they've gone. Let us not fail that peace for all to find. 'Neath the row on row of crosses white, their bodies lie at rest. Above them waves the stars and stripes for which they gave their best. Their sacrifice must always be a symbol of freeman's right. They paid the price of liberty, our sons who died in fight. Thank you.
I'm sure now you know why we invited Vince Bass to be with us today. And it's always difficult to follow him when he does his speech. At this time, we will have a placing of the wreaths at the grave of Henry Gunther. So any individuals or organizations who have a wreath, would you please meet me, and then we will place the wreath. And I would ask everyone to stand when you hear taps. Thank you. Franklin? I'm going to let you carry this one. You follow me. Place your wreath and step back, please. Present. On. Bugle it. Bugle it. Left, haste. Forward, heart. At this time, I would like to thank the Dame Meyer Choir, and Dan Meyer, would you lead us? and for everybody singing God Bless America.
God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Thank you, everyone. Reverend Otto, would you lead us in the benediction?
It is an honor and a privilege that I, as a German-born New American, bring words of benediction and blessing at this occasion. The German Society of Maryland erected the marker of Sergeant Henry Gunther's grave, commemorating his exceptional bravery and heroic action, honoring his exceptional loyalty to his country, the United States of America. November 11th, Armistice Day, became an international holiday celebrating the end of all hostility, the end of World War I. This war resulted in the estimated 40 million military and civilian deaths, ranking it among the deadliest conflict of human history in its time, only to be surpassed by the number of dead in World War II. We now observe November 11th as Veterans Day, honoring all veterans who have worn the cloth of our nation. Yesterday's Sun paper on page 11 under Maryland Voices had a commentary with the title, Celebrate Peace, Not War, by Madeline Misko, a novelist and author who served on the Army Nurses Corps. She concluded her article, "We believe that a day celebrating peace, not war, is the best way to honor the sacrifices of veterans." Let me conclude with a word of divine promise and a challenge for our own morality. From Isaiah, the 2nd chapter, verse 4. The Lord shall judge between nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. May this happen. May God bless us. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. While we're still here, I would just like to recognize a few people who I missed before. I would like to thank Jerry Danaher, who's the faithful navigator of the Charles Carrollton 4th degree Knights of Columbus, for bringing his color guard. I would also like to recognize and thank Ronald Holcomb, the Vice Commander of the American Legion, Department of Maryland. Thank you so much for coming. I would also like to recognize Mr. Walter Mathers. Walter is a member of the German Society, and he initiated the memorial observances for Henry Gunther 10 years ago, and I would just like to recognize him and thank him for everything that he did. At this time, I would just like to tell everyone from the German Society and other ones here too that we will be taking a panoramic photograph of all members of the German Society by Henry Gunther's grave. So when the service is over, which will be very soon, please get over there. And also Paul Gallione, the photographer studio, has been taking pictures during the ceremony, and they will be put on a CD. If you would like a CD, they're $20 a piece, and I have forms on the white SUV as you walk up the road. Just take a form out. Thank you so much for coming. The day was beautiful. The service was grand, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming. Thank you very much.